Good day, future CPAs. We are from the Spartans Group and today we are going to discuss Chapter 14 which is entitled Book Value Per Share. Book Value Per Share. It measures the amount each share would receive assuming the entity is liquidated and its assets are sold and its liabilities are settled exactly at the amount reported on the Statement of Financial Position. So, ito yung amount na matatanggap ng bawat isang shareholder base sa shares na mayroon sila. Matatanggap ito after maliquidate lahat ng assets at mabayaran lahat ng utang ng kumpanya. Liquidation means closing up the business or dissolving it. Where there is only one class of shares, the formula for the computation of book value per share is total shareholders' equity divided by number of share outstanding. Yun yung gagamiting formula if isa lang yung kind ng shares mayroon ng isang business. Where there are two or more classes of shares, the formula are as follows. Book value per share is equals to preference shareholders' equity divided by number of preference shares outstanding kapag preference shares. Next is book value per share is equals to ordinary shareholders' equity divided by number of ordinary shares outstanding kapag naman ordinary shares. So, ito naman yung formula pag hindi lang isa yung kind of shares mayroon ng business. The total shareholders' equity is allocated between the different classes of shares. Yung nakalaan na equity sa iba't ibang shares, i-divide sa number of outstanding shares. So, mayroon tayong dalawang klase ng shares, preference shares and ordinary shares. Next, when allocating total shareholders' equity to the different classes of shares, the residual equity theory is applied. The ordinary shareholders' equity is a residual amount after deducting preference shareholders' equity from the total shareholders' equity. Next is preference shareholders' equity. The following are guidelines when computing for preference shareholders' equity. 1. Allocate to the preference shareholders' equity their liquidation value. In the absence of liquidation value, allocate their aggregate par value. Ang matatanggap ng preference shareholders ay yung liquidation value. Kung walang liquidation value, may matatanggap pa rin silang dividend in arrears. Number 2, if the preference shares are cumulative, allocate all dividends in arrear. Pag sinabing cumulative, lahat ng dividend including the previous 3 years ay matatanggap ng preference shareholders. Number 3, if the preference shares are non-cumulative, allocate the current year dividend only if it is in arrear. So, pag naman non-cumulative, yung current year lang matatanggap. Number 4, if there are no dividends in arrears, no dividend shall be allocated to either cumulative or non-cumulative preference shares. So, pag walang dividend, wala ding mabigay sa cumulative at non-cumulative preference shares. So, next, we have two different types of preferences which are preferences as to asset, priority claims on assets in the event of corporate liquidation. So, preferences as to asset is equals to liquidation value plus dividend in arrears. Next is preferences as to dividends. Receipt of dividends when declared before the ordinary shareholder. So, depende kung anong klaseng preference siya. Next is outstanding shares. Pertain to shares that are entitled to dividends. The number of outstanding shares is computed as follows. Number of shares issued plus number of shares subscribed, then less number of treasury shares, and after that we will get number of shares outstanding. Next is subscription receivable. Subscription receivable is not deducted from total shareholders' equity or simply ignored when computing the total shareholders' equity. So, kaya hindi binabawas yung subscription receivable kasi ito yung ginagamit para masettle yung ibang obligation ng kumpanya sa mga creditors. So, next, let's have an example. ABC Co's year-end shareholders' equity consists of the following: share capital na 1 million, subscribed share capital na 500,000, share premium na 370,000, subscription receivable na 200,000, retained earnings na 660,000, revaluation surplus na 140,000, cumulative translation losses on foreign operation na 100,000, treasury shares na 70,000. So, paano nakuha yung total shareholders equity? minus lang yung treasury shares na 70,000 at yung cumulative translation na 100,000, tsaka yung subscription receivable na 200,000. So, ang total ay 2,300,000. Pero yung requirement, compute for the book value per share. So, next, para makuha natin yung requirement, kailangan nating hanapin yung book value per share na equals to total shareholders equity divided by number of shares outstanding. So, yung total shareholders equity natin kanina ay 2,300,000. Ngayon, naging 2,500,000 na siya. Kasi yung subscription receivable ay hindi binabawas sa total shareholders equity kapag hinahanap yung book value per share. Kaya naging 2,500,000 na siya. Then divide lang sa shares outstanding na 140,000. Ang magiging sagot dyan ay 17.86. So next example, two classes of shares naman. ABC Co's year-end shareholders equity consists of the following: preference shares na 2 million, ordinary share na 1 million, at retained earning na 820,000. So inad lang lahat yan, kaya nakuha yung 3,820,000 na total shareholders equity. So additional info, dividends are in arrears for 3 years. Ang requirement, compute for the book value per share for each class of shares. So next ay ang solution for two classes of shares. So dito naman kailangan nating hanapin yung book value per shares ng ordinary shares at book value per share ng preference shares. So first, kailangan nating i-subtract yung preference shareholders equity sa total shareholders equity para makuha natin yung ordinary shareholders equity. So 3,820,000 minus 2,600,000 is equals to 1,220,000 na ordinary shareholders equity. Next is divide by number of ordinary shares outstanding na 100,000. Kaya ang total ay 12.20 at yun ay ang magiging book value per shares ng ordinary shares. Next naman ay yung book value per share ng preference share. So, yung preference shareholders equity ay 2,600,000 divide by number of preference shares outstanding na 20,000. Kaya ang makuha ay 130 at yun ang magiging book value per share ng preference share. Illustration number 3, cumulative preference shares with liquidation value. ABC Co's year-end shareholders equity consists of the following: preference shares 2 million, ordinary shares 1 million, retained earning 820,000, total shareholders equity 3,820,000. Additional info, dividends are in arrears for 3 years. So dito sa problem ay given na liquidation value 120 pesos per share. So kapag may liquidation value, yun yung gagamitin natin para makuha yung aggregate par value sa computation. Instead na yung 100 pesos par. So 20,000 shares times 120 liquidation value is equals to 2,400,000. Tapos yung dividends in arrear 600,000, kaya merong 3 million sa preference shareholders equity. Then subtract lang sa 3,820,000, kaya ang sagot sa ordinary shareholders equity ay 820,000. Then divide lang sa 100,000, kaya ang sagot ay 8.20. Illustration number 4, non-cumulative preference shares. ABC Co's year-end shareholders equity consists of the following: preference shares 10% non-cumulative na 2 million, ordinary share 1 million, retained earning 820,000, total shareholders equity 3,820,000. Additional info, dividends are in arrears for 3 years. So dito sa problem, non-cumulative yung preference shares. Kapag non-cumulative, yung current year lang ng dividends ang kukunin natin. So dito sa solution, halos parehas lang sila ng computation dun sa cumulative. Ang kinaibahan lang ay yung dividends in arrear. Dito sa non-cumulative, 200,000 lang yung dividends in arrear kasi current year lang naman yung kukunin natin. So 2 million times 10% times 1, kaya 200,000. Then aggregate par value 2 million, kaya 2,200,000 yung preference shareholders equity. Then subtract lang sa 3,820,000, kaya ang ordinary shareholders equity ay 1,620,000. Then divide lang sa 100,000, kaya 16.20 ang sagot. Illustration number 5, no dividends in arrear. So parehas lang sila ng problem sa mga nauna. Preference shares 10% non-cumulative, So again, kapag non-cumulative, yung current year lang kukunin sa dividends. Pero may additional info dito na preferences dividends were paid up to year-end, thus there are no dividends in arrear. So paano makukuha yung book value per share for ordinary shares kapag walang dividend in arrears? Next, solution. Total shareholders equity is equals to 3,820,000. Then subtract sa preference shareholders equity na 2 million. Walang nakalagay dun sa dividends in arrear ng preference shareholders equity. No dividends are allocated because there are no dividends in arrear. Kaya ang total lang ng ordinary shareholders equity ay 1,820,000. Then divide lang sa 100,000 kaya nakuha yung 18.20. Participating preference shares. So when preference shares are participating, the excess of total shareholder equity over the allocated amounts to preference shares and ordinary shares is allocated to both participating preference shares and ordinary shares pro rata based on aggregate par value. So number 1, allocate to preference shares their liquidation value or aggregate par value. If preference shares are cumulative, allocate all dividends in arrear. If preference are non-cumulative, allocate current year dividend only if it is in arrear. Next, no dividend shall be allocated if there are no dividends in arrear. Number 2, ordinary shares are allocated 1-year dividends using the lowest preference dividend rate. Number 3, yung balance ng participation ay allocated to the various classes of shares pro rata based on aggregate par value.